We all know that exercise is critical for our health, but we're super busy, so we need to extract the maximum benefit from the exercise that we do manage to do in the limited time we have. And the good news is that emerging research is radically shifting our understanding. We now know that we can reap surprisingly large benefits from much smaller amounts of exercise. So how much exercise do we really need to see significant health impacts? We'll go through the eye-opening numbers from some recent studies. As we age, we begin to lose muscle mass, and it starts much earlier than most people think. After age 30, muscle mass decreases from 3 to 8% per decade, and after 60, it accelerates. And this is associated with a whole host of problems, like increasing the risk of falls, rising fat mass, and the loss of bone density and insulin resistance. It's one of the main reasons why exercise is so critical. But new research is showing us that getting enough is much easier than we previously thought. A first study that we'll look at relates to frequency. How often do we need to exercise to capture its benefits? The standard recommendation is to exercise throughout the week. So for instance, the National Health Service in the UK recommends that we exercise evenly over 4 to 5 days a week, or ideally every day. And when you combine that with the World Health Organization target of 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity exercise a week, it's really tough for most people to do. Suppose that you aim for the lower target of 150 minutes, but spread that out over 5 days. That's half an hour of exercise a day, and when we add in things like driving back and forth from the gym and showering afterwards, this all adds up to a lot of time, especially when factoring in work commitments and childcare at home. So it would be a huge help if we could reduce the number of days that we exercise. But would we get the same benefits? Well, some earlier studies raised doubts. One analysis looked at a cohort of over 8,000 men. They divided them into groups that were based on how they exercised. So they called one group the weekend warriors. These were people who crammed all of the exercise into 1 or 2 days. Researchers compared their mortality risk to those who spread the exercise throughout the week, and when compared to a group that was sedentary, the weekend warriors had a mortality risk that was 15% lower, but for those who spread their exercise throughout the week, it was a whopping 36% lower. And what's more, when they looked at those men with at least one major risk factor, the difference between the weekend warriors and those who weren't exercising at all disappeared. There was a more recent, larger cohort study that had similar results. It also compared sedentary, weekend warrior, and regular activity groups, and looking at all-cause mortality, the benefits appeared to be less clear for the weekend warrior group. But those earlier studies had a crucial drawback. They relied upon surveys where people reported how much they exercised, and this can introduce a whole host of inaccuracies into the data. And that's why a study that was published just last month is so groundbreaking. Researchers didn't rely on questionnaires, which are notorious for being inaccurate. Instead, they drew upon data from the massive UK Biobank cohort. In addition to providing all sorts of other health-related data, about 90,000 participants in this cohort also used a wearable device to measure their activity for 1 week between 2013 and 2015. This is far more accurate than questionnaires. The study looked at mortality risks for those participants after about 8 years, and they divided the participants into inactive, weekend warriors, and regular active groups. The results were a game changer. Compared to the inactive group, the weekend warrior group had an all-cause mortality risk reduction of 32% over the 8-year time frame. This was actually better than the regular activity group's risk reduction of 26%. The numbers showed a similar pattern when it came to deaths from heart disease and cancer. The risk reductions for weekend warriors were stronger. And researchers found another intriguing result when they examined the research more closely. To identify physically active participants in the study, they relied upon the WHO's minimum recommendation of 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. They also included participants who were a bit below this number, with at least 115 minutes per week. Surprisingly, the risk reductions were just as strong for those with 115 minutes of activity compared to those who hit the 150-minute target. Now, I want to add some cautions here with interpreting these results. The weekend warriors didn't actually cram all of their physical activity into just 2 days. So for this study, they were defined as those who got the majority of the exercise in just 1 to 2 days. But the study does show us something important. If we're time pressured, we don't have to spread our physical activity evenly to gain its benefits. We don't have to head to the gym 5 times a week. And it does raise an intriguing question. Again, researchers found that the benefits were just as strong at 115 minutes a week compared to 150. But even that amount can feel like a stretch for many of us. So can we go lower? Well, the same wearable tech used in the study has revealed some shocking evidence for just how low we can go. In the past, studies generally focused on structured exercise, so in other words, they tended to measure activities like going for a walk, lifting weights, and so forth. The reason is that we're much better at accurately recalling our activity when it comes to this form. And if you think about it, if I ask you how much exercise you got in the past week, it's those types of activities that will immediately come to mind. But we often engage in physical activity that isn't structured in that way. So for example, you might go up and down the stairs in your house several times a day, and maybe you recently carried out several heavy boxes to the trash and raked up the grass clippings in your yard. For me, jumping on the trampoline with my kids is something that I wouldn't necessarily count towards exercise, but it's these types of activities that are really hard to accurately recall. It's also been hard to measure in these studies. That is, until recently, wearable motion trackers give us a way to objectively measure these types of activities without memory, and that unlocks an entirely new stream of data. Another group of researchers recently took advantage of this data to make a startling discovery. They were looking at the same UK Biobank cohort as the first study that we covered, but this time they focused their attention on non-exercisers. So these were people who reported no leisurely time exercise and no more than one recreational walk per week. Even though they didn't participate in structured exercise, researchers were curious about their physical activity throughout the week, and in particular, they looked for how often they had vigorous activity as they went about their daily life. They often call this type of activity rigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity, or VILPA. They then analysed how levels of VILPA are associated with all-cause heart disease and cancer mortality, and it's this type of exercise that would generally be invisible to traditional study methods. And here's what they discovered. So let's start with the median number of how many times a person engaged in these types of physical activity. The median was about 3 bouts of activity a day, lasting about 1 to 2 minutes each. Now remember, these are traditionally non-exercises. So all of this vigorous activity that they're getting in a typical week, it amounts to about 6 minutes a day at most, so just 42 minutes a week. But what difference does it make? Well, compared to those who didn't do any of this type of exercise, the median frequency was associated with an incredible 38% reduction in all-cause cancer and mortality risks, and there was a 48% reduction in heart disease mortality risk. These risk reductions are comparable to the numbers that we saw earlier in the Weekend Warrior study, but here, participants were getting at least 115 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. So is it really possible to extract the same benefits in less than half the time? But here's where things get a bit tricky. In the comparison groups, the two studies aren't exactly the same. In the Weekend Warrior study, the inactive group includes everyone getting less than 115 minutes of weekly moderate physical activity. Notice that this would include those getting 42 minutes of VILPA, but in contrast, the inactive group on the study on VILPA is getting 0 vigorous physical activity. They are truly sedentary. So since the groups that we're comparing aren't exactly the same, we can't directly compare the magnitude of impact. But there is an important clue in the data that the benefits from the modest amounts of VILPA could be quite similar to those enjoyed by people who hit the WHO targets. And here's why. This study showed that exercise has a strong dose-response relationship that fades the more that we get of it. So in other words, the first chunk of exercise is more beneficial than the second, and that second is more beneficial than the third, and so on, until we reach a point where it makes little difference. So look at this chart from the study. When we go from no bouts of VILPA to 1 bout a day, the mortality risks drop sharply. But by the time that we get from 4 to 5, the drop is barely perceptible. This tells us that going from sedentary to a little bit of activity captures a large share of the benefits that we'll see from exercise. So for someone who works in a little bit of VILPA and someone who exercises regularly, they're both going to see massive gains compared to someone who is truly inactive. So what does this research mean for our exercise targets? Should we totally ignore the WHO recommendations? Well, the first lesson is this: moving from inactive to active is the most important step, and adding just a little bit of vigorous activity into our daily routine pays massive dividends. So if you need the extra motivation to start moving, this is the data to look at. And this is actually really important. Despite the fact that we all know how essential exercise is to our health, most adults over 40 don't do it regularly. And the reason why is that it can feel overwhelming to work in 150 minutes of structured activity into the week. So many people don't even try. What these studies show us is that it isn't all or nothing. Because of time constraints and other commitments, just because we can't do 150 minutes of physical activity, it doesn't mean that we can't dramatically improve our health with much less. And that knowledge is empowering. boring. The second lesson is that exercise doesn't have to fit the traditional pattern. We don't have to set aside an hour to go to the gym. The VILPA study shows us that we can get huge benefits from bouts of vigorous activity, just 1 to 2 minutes in length. And this is why I always encourage my patients at the clinic to try to add exercise snacks in their day. So personally, I do some sets of push-ups or wall squats during my breaks when I'm at work, and I can easily do 1 to 2 minute bouts of activity 3 to 5 times a day. And there are many other options as well, so instead of using the elevator at work, choose to use the stairs. You can park further away from your workplace, so long as it's safe to do so, and have a 5 to 10 minute walk to your work. Now, just to be clear, if you do have the time to exercise more frequently, you will get additional benefits. So one long-term cohort study even found that we could gain additional health benefits from getting up to 300 minutes a week, all the way up to 600 minutes a week. So if you want to truly maximize your health benefits from exercise, those targets are useful. So personally, I aim for those targets because I don't want to leave any gains on the table. And that's why I also take creatine and TMG as part of Microvitamin Plus powder to boost my workout capacity. But just because I take a supplement does not in any way mean that you should as well. The point I want to emphasize is that we can do a lot of good for our health at much lower volumes of exercise, and all of us can add exercise snacks into our schedule no matter how busy we are. When it comes to exercise though, the specific kind of activity that we're doing also matters. So to see which types are particularly powerful for slowing down the aging process and maintaining vitality, make sure to check out this next video here where I go through all of the latest research.